Leicester, England, January 14, 1941. Inside an unassuming factory on Waterloo Road, a woman in a gray overall coat folds a piece of paper no thicker than a cigarette paper into a square, barely larger than a postage stamp. She works without speaking, because speaking is forbidden here, and because the men who deliver her instructions each morning never explain what they are for. She slides the folded square into a cavity carved into a small plastic token shaped like a boot. The token is set aside with dozens of others, indistinguishable from anything a family might find under the Christmas tree. Within days, this token will be packed into a box bearing a name familiar to almost every household in Britain and America. The box says Monopoly. It will travel by lorry, then by ship, then by parachute or Red Cross van, into the hands of men who have not seen a woman, a home, or a free road in years. Hidden beneath the dice and the paper money is a silk map of Germany, a working compass, and sometimes real currency disguised as play money. This is not a toy. It is an escape kit, and it is about to save lives that history very nearly forgot to record. To understand why a board game became a smuggling device, you first have to understand what it felt like to be trapped behind barbed wire with nothing but time. That single object, sitting quietly on a shelf in a prisoner of war camp, would become one of the strangest and most effective weapons of the entire war. Nobody watching a game of Monopoly unfold in a German-run camp could have guessed that the properties on the board were not Mayfair and Park Lane at all, but something else entirely, something that could mean the difference between captivity and freedom. By the middle of 1940, Britain faced a problem that had no obvious solution. Tens of thousands of British and Commonwealth servicemen were already prisoners of the Third Reich, and that number was climbing by the week following the fall of France and the chaotic retreat from Dunkirk. Every one of these men represented a strategic and moral liability. Trained pilots, experienced officers, and skilled engineers sat idle in camps scattered across occupied Europe, unable to contribute to the war effort and vulnerable to the psychological toll of indefinite captivity. Escape was not merely a matter of personal courage. It was, from the perspective of British military intelligence, a legitimate weapon of war. An escaped officer who returned to Britain brought with him invaluable intelligence about German troop movements, camp locations, and the geography of occupied territory. He also forced the Germans to divert manpower into recapture efforts, tying down soldiers who might otherwise be deployed elsewhere. The trouble was that escaping required tools nobody was allowed to have. A map of the local terrain was perhaps the single most valuable item an escaping prisoner could possess, and yet paper maps were heavy, bulky, noisy to unfold, and impossible to conceal from the routine searches that German guards, known to prisoners as goons, conducted with grim regularity. A standard printed map, if discovered, would immediately identify its owner as a flight risk and result in solitary confinement, or worse. Compasses were similarly compromising. Metal detectors and thorough hand searches at the entrances to camps like Stalag Luft III meant that anything resembling a compass needle would be found within moments. Even something as simple as local currency, essential for bribing a guard or purchasing train tickets after a successful breakout, was strictly forbidden and immediately confiscated if discovered on a prisoner's person. Red Cross parcels, the lifeline through which prisoners received food, clothing, and books from home, were meticulously inspected by German censors before distribution. Every seam was checked, every tin of food was opened and inspected, every book was flicked through page by page. The Geneva Convention permitted these parcels as a matter of basic humanitarian decency, and the Germans, for their part, generally respected the system, if only because reciprocal treatment protected their own prisoners held by the Allies. But this very system, designed to sustain morale and provide comfort, was also the only reliable channel by which anything could reach a prisoner from the outside world. If escape equipment could not travel through official parcels without detection, it could not reach the men who needed it at all. The challenge, then, was not simply how to make a compass small enough to hide. It was how to make an entire escape kit invisible to a search regime built specifically to catch exactly this kind of smuggling. By late 1940, the problem looked, to any reasonable observer, entirely unsolvable. The organization tasked with solving it was MI9, a branch of British military intelligence established in December 1939 specifically to assist prisoners of war in escaping and evading capture. Its offices, unglamorously located at the War Office in London, were staffed by a small team under the command of Major Norman Crockett, a decorated veteran of the First World War who understood better than most the psychological value of hope inside a prison camp. Crockett recruited a peculiar assortment of specialists, including a games manufacturer named Waddington's, based in Leeds, whose printing technology happened to be exactly suited to solving the escape problem nobody else could crack. Waddington's held the British license to produce Monopoly, and in doing so had developed, quite by accident, one of the few printing processes in the country capable of producing silk maps. Silk, unlike paper, could be folded and refolded thousands of times without tearing along the creases. It made almost no sound when unfolded, unlike a stiff paper map, which crackled loudly enough to be heard through a hut wall in the dead of night. Silk could also be soaked, buried, or sewn into a lining without disintegrating, and it dried perfectly readable afterwards. Waddington's had been experimenting with printing directly onto silk for playing cards and had perfected a technique that kept the ink from bleeding into the fibers, producing crisp, legible detail even at a very small scale. The technology existed. What MI9 needed was a delivery method that German censors would never think to examine. Monopoly proved to be the ideal Trojan horse for several practical reasons. It was manufactured under license by Waddington's already, meaning the production line, the staff, and the packaging materials were all in place and unremarkable to outside observers. The game box was large enough to conceal a genuinely useful quantity of equipment, considerably more than could be hidden inside a deck of cards or a tin of boiled sweets. Crucially, board games were an approved category of item for Red Cross parcels, sent by the thousand to relieve the crushing boredom of camp life, and a new Monopoly set arriving for a prisoner raised no suspicion whatsoever among censors already overwhelmed by the sheer volume of parcels passing through their hands. Inside a small number of specially marked sets, distinguishable to insiders by a tiny red dot printed in the corner of the free parking square, the game board itself contained a silk map folded flat beneath the printed paper surface, sandwiched so precisely that the board looked and felt identical to any other. Hollowed-out sections beneath the hotel and house pieces held a working compass, roughly the size of a shirt button, alongside a miniature file for cutting through wire. The banknotes, printed on the same presses used for the standard game currency, occasionally included genuine German, Italian, or French banknotes mixed in among the fake Monopoly money, indistinguishable at a glance to anyone not specifically looking for them. A prisoner in on the secret, tipped off through coded language in an otherwise innocent letter from home, would know to look for the marked box among the pile of games donated to the camp's recreation room, and would know precisely where to find each concealed item without damaging it. The entire operation was staffed almost exclusively by civilians who had signed the Official Secrets Act, many of them women working on the factory floor at Leeds who were never told the true purpose of what they were assembling. They understood only that their work was sensitive and that questions were unwelcome. This compartmentalized secrecy proved essential, because it meant that even if a worker were somehow interrogated, there was almost nothing of substance she could reveal. The maps themselves, printed for regions of Germany, Italy, France, Norway, and the Balkans, depending on where a prisoner was likely to attempt escape, were produced with extraordinary attention to detail, showing railway lines, rivers, and border crossings at a scale fine enough to be genuinely useful for cross-country travel on foot. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more of this remarkable story still to come. Distribution of the doctored sets relied on a fictitious charitable organization invented specifically to provide cover, since a game arriving directly from Waddington's might have drawn unwelcome attention from German intelligence, who were not blind to the possibility of escape aids being smuggled through parcels. Names such as the Licensed Victuallers Prisoners Relief Fund were used as the sender of record, giving no indication of any connection to military intelligence or to Waddington's itself. Prisoners who were meant to receive a doctored set were informed through prearranged signals, sometimes as simple as a specific phrase in a letter from a supposed relative, alerting them to watch for a particular parcel among the general shipments arriving at the camp. Documented use of these kits remains frustratingly incomplete, since MY9 deliberately destroyed most of its detailed records after the war to protect the individuals involved and to preserve the method in case it was needed again in a future conflict. What survives comes largely from post-war testimony of former prisoners and MY9 officers who spoke, often decades later, about specific escapes they believed had been aided by concealed maps and compasses. Ari Neve, who became one of the few men to make a successful home run from Colditz Castle in January 1942, later worked for MY9 himself and confirmed that escape aids of exactly this kind, though not necessarily from a Monopoly set specifically, had circulated within the camp system and materially assisted breakouts. Estimates suggest that roughly 35,000 Allied prisoners attempted escape during the war, with somewhere in the region of the low thousands succeeding in reaching neutral or Allied territory, though precise figures tied specifically to Monopoly-based kits are, by design, almost impossible to isolate from the broader picture of MI9's efforts. The psychological effect on prisoners is easier to assess than the material one. Camp morale, according to numerous post-war accounts, was measurably improved simply by the knowledge that escape materials might be circulating somewhere within the compound, whether or not any individual prisoner ever laid hands on them. Hope itself became a kind of contraband, smuggled in alongside the silk and the compasses. German counterintelligence never appeared to develop an equivalent program of comparable sophistication. German prisoners held in British and American camps, by contrast, mounted their own escape attempts using improvised tools fashioned from cutlery, tin cans, and stolen tools, but there is little evidence the German High Command invested in anything resembling MI9's industrial-scale concealment operation. This asymmetry reflected differing strategic priorities. Germany, by 1941 and 1942, held far fewer prisoners in circumstances where escape to friendly territory was geographically plausible, since most Allied camps sat deep within occupied Europe or Germany itself, hundreds of miles from any border a prisoner could realistically reach on foot. American efforts, once the United States entered the war, largely piggybacked on MY9's existing infrastructure rather than developing a parallel system from scratch, with the American equivalent organization, MIS-X, adopting remarkably similar techniques, including their own doctored games and concealed compasses, sometimes coordinating directly with their British counterparts to share printing techniques and distribution networks. The scale of the American program, once underway, arguably exceeded the British one in raw output, producing hundreds of thousands of escape aids by the war's end, though it built directly upon groundwork that MY9 had already established. Assessing the true impact of the Monopoly escape kits requires holding two things in tension: the extraordinary ingenuity of the concept and the genuine uncertainty about how many escapes it directly enabled. What can be said with confidence is that the program represented an almost perfect fusion of civilian industry and military necessity, turning a beloved parlor game into a genuinely effective intelligence tool without ever alerting the enemy to what was happening. Waddington's continued manufacturing standard, unmodified Monopoly sets throughout the war, maintaining the fiction that nothing whatsoever was unusual about their production line, a deception that held for the war's entire duration and was not widely publicized until decades afterwards. The technique influenced later Cold War-era escape and evasion programs, where concealment within everyday objects became a standard doctrine for intelligence services on both sides of the Iron Curtain. A small number of surviving examples of the doctored game sets, along with the silk maps themselves, can today be viewed at the Imperial War Museum in London and at the Waddington's archive materials held in Leeds, offering a tangible link to a story that, for decades, existed only in the recollections of the men and women sworn to silence. Return for a moment to that factory floor in Leicester, to the woman folding silk into a boot-shaped token without knowing what her hands were building. Multiply her by the dozens of workers across the Waddington's factory in Leeds who did the same, day after day, year after year, never speaking of it, many taking the details of their work to their graves. Consider the prisoner in a hut somewhere in occupied Europe, lifting the lid off a Monopoly box donated to the camp's recreation room, running his thumb along the underside of the board until he feels the seam that should not be there. Consider what a folded square of silk, no larger than a stamp, meant to a man who had not chosen a direction to walk in for years. It meant a map. It meant a route out. It meant, however briefly, that the wire around him was not the end of the story. What Britain built inside those cardboard boxes was not merely a clever trick of concealment. It was a statement about where hope could hide when it needed to. A silk map folded into a board game. A compass disguised as a game piece. A currency note mixed among fake money so convincingly that even a trained eye might miss it. None of it looked like a weapon. All of it was one. The men who assembled these kits in Leeds never fired a shot in this war, and yet their handiwork traveled further behind enemy lines than almost any bullet could reach, carried not by force but by an unremarkable cardboard box addressed to a prisoner of war camp, disguised as nothing more than an evening's entertainment. That, in the end, is the story of the Monopoly escape kit. Not a game at all. A door, folded flat, waiting for the right hands to find it.